Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Gooey's Dungeon Dive, the show where I rank all of the dungeons in The Legend of Zelda. It's Gooey here. We're continuing our Wind Waker adventure with Corey Richmond. How's it going, Corey?
Going good.
After we helped Medley take her place as the Sage of Earth to help us restore some of the power to the Master Sword, we must now turn our attention to the Sage of Wind, Fado. We must find the one who plays the same instrument as him, which is this violin. We should recall that the character that we have seen play this is Makar, the Korok, and we can find him back at the Forest Haven, hiding behind a waterfall, practicing his little violin. We can help conduct him in the Wind God's aria. We get another nice little scene where he awakens and plays with us. It's cute, you know. It's not as touching as the medley stuff, but you know, Makar, he's a cute little guy.
I like seeing Fado and Link bow.
They get a round of applause. So this now allows us to enter our next dungeon, which is the Wind Temple. There is obviously a wind-themed element to this dungeon, as you find yourself using the Deku Leaf to flip switches and float around and avoiding or using gusts of wind. This is most notably in the dungeon's large central room, which has a fan that can be activated, which allows gliding to, you know, different levels or areas of this large room. Like in Ocarina of Time, we also see use of the iron boots, which allows us to move against the wind that would normally push Link back.
Something that's interesting about this dungeon, which you kind of tell from right off the bat, especially in contrast to the last two dungeons, this one seems a lot more like platformy and movement based, and it almost reminds me of Forbidden Woods in that way. Because in that dungeon you had a lot of use of the Deku Leaf, and you're using the Boko Buds to shoot yourself up. And there's a similar mechanic in this one where you use the metal springs in tandem with the iron boots to spring yourself up, and then follow it up with the Deku Leaf.
And the iron boots, they get a heavy, feature here as well. They are required to, gain entrance, to the entrance of the dungeon. Mm-hmm. So, this is kind of their time to shine as well. It's not just, the wind or those little mechanisms you press down, but there's, little parts where you break through weak cracks in the floor. I'll skip ahead a little bit and talk about the dungeon item here, because it also gets mixed in with using the hook shot, which I think is pretty cool. There's a lot of item interactions here. So, we get the hook shot, and like in previous games, it'll pull Link closer to an object it can hook into, or pull certain things closer to Link. But when you equip the iron boots, really heavy objects, it can actually pull them down off the wall. Mm-hmm. There's those large statues, and you can use it to break them down.
Especially because we talked about in Tower of the Gods how we start to see stuff like physical weight, that sort of real world mechanic being implemented into the video game. It's kind of a similar thing here in a cool little item interaction. It's you put on the iron boots, so you're much heavier than whatever object you're pulling, meaning that's going to move as opposed to you moving.
So we talked about it has a wind theme, but also I was thinking here with you have the giant fan in the room and those little contraptions that fling you into the air. The hookshot itself, even some of the enemies and spikes and traps all around the dungeon too, give the dungeon itself sort of this mechanical trap vibe. I think people say this kind of has a forest feel, but I think it's actually kind of minor. I think there's a forest element to this only in that this dungeon feels like this big mechanical chamber or whatever in all these side rooms that are experiencing some overgrowth.
On top of that too, the Makar's main mechanic is that he grows trees, and there's a bunch of spots in the dungeon where you basically grow trees, so it's got that kind of ties in with the aesthetic too. And before we talk about that actual mechanic, I also just want to mention on the aesthetic front, I think this dungeon has the best dungeon music of the game.
I also wrote that down because I was going to mention it later, only because there's a couple other elements to this dungeon. We can talk about it now, but there's multiple elements to this dungeon that I feel like I noticed were all conveyed in this theme. Like there's like 4 different things going on that all work really well together. And I was like, oh, like this is very, I don't know, it works really well as like a score to what's going on in the dungeon here.
The use of instrumentation in this theme is really cool, but it's also got this weird kind of like, I don't want to say spooky, it's something else. It's kind of like mysterious almost.
It reminds me, to jump ahead, there's one element of it that reminds me sort of City in the Sky. And I guess it has some similar mechanical elements there too. But it has, there's this feeling of, there's something ancient here that we don't quite understand what it is. Then there is some, like, a bit of, like, the forest element. There's some playfulness in the theme that pops up. And then there's also sort of ominous sort of feeling.
Yeah.
Or, like you're being, like, kind of watched, and I felt like that element was conveying, like, in this dungeon, like all the other dungeons in the game, we have, like, a presence of, like, Ganon's forces that have infiltrated the dungeon. And there's even, like, you know, there's the moblins again, but there's even those, like, sick, like, mini-boss rooms where you get multiple dark nuts and the wizrobes or whatever.
Those are the
so
best,
I feel like all of this is all comes across in the theme, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
In the actual dungeon theme music.
Well, I was gonna say too that, like, kind of building off of that mysterious, like, weirdness, weird presence, like, one of the more reoccurring enemies in this dungeon is wizrobes. You see wizrobes popping up all over the place, which I think fits in with the theme of the dungeon really well, but on top of that, a lot of this dungeon has you doing platforming stuff and floating on the Deku Leaf, and I think the wizrobe is a really good enemy to kind of challenge that, because they're shooting long-distance projectiles at you that you really have to look out for if you're floating across a long gap, you know?
So I like that idea of, you mentioned, like, the planting the seeds as Makar. I feel like you're sort of exploiting the overgrowth a little bit, which is kind of fun. I guess that's sort of like what's going on in both this dungeon and the last dungeon. In the last dungeon, there was darkness and you're penetrating it with the light. And then in here, it's kind of this, like I said, you're exploiting that overgrowth. You're making your own little trees and hookshotting to them or whatever else. They trigger certain obstacles or enemies or whatever, what have you. But yeah, you're also continuing that same mechanic of, like, working together with someone, with Makar as opposed to Medley. When these two are often compared, like, people often say, like, they love controlling Medley, but they, like, hate controlling Makar or, like, playing as him or, like, with him or something. And I don't know. Playing it, I never get that same feeling. Like, I like escorting Makar around and stuff like that.
Makar's ability and controlling Makar, I think, just in practice are significantly less fun than controlling Medley. I feel like Medley controls better and she flies a little bit better. And also, using her mirror reflecting shield, I think, is used for intuitive puzzles and thinking required puzzles a lot more than something like Makar, where with Makar you see a patch of dirt and you're like, okay, I just walk up to it and press A and plant a thing, and then Link can go on his way. But on the flip side of that, as opposed to feeling like a co-op thing, it kind of felt more like Makar is the goods. Makar is the treasure that I gotta escort around. I need Makar in these specific spots. And I think they kind of play into that in the dungeon too, because there's that section before you get to the central room where you have to plant a bunch of seeds to get the gate to open, and then it's choreographed that he gets captured. And you're like, oh no, yes. I gotta find where he is and I gotta rescue him.
With the flying, I don't think it really controls that different even. I think it's more just the way it comes off, but I think a big part of it is in the last dungeon, like, Medley flying isn't really that, like, there's a couple puzzles you fly to a switch, you know what I mean? It's not that complicated, it's not that, you know, it's not really that challenging. And here, like, you got a fan that's blowing you around. You have to do it a lot more. And I think just that of, like, sometimes trying to navigate against the wind and things like that, I think it's more of the circumstance. I guess that is, like, a case of in the dungeon, but for me, I actually like that. I like that element is being used more. The one thing I get, but I actually kind of like this, is he just is, like, when he's following you, he's just, in general, he's slower. And I do notice, like, you gotta like wait for him. But to me, that added to it. I felt like, come on, little buddy, let's go. Well, you mentioned he's the good, so I'm often like, okay, here, come on, and I'll pick him up.
Yeah,
you know
exactly.
What I mean? I feel like I'm carrying like Yoda around on my back or whatever.
That's how I feel too. There are a couple spots in the dungeon. We saw this in the Earth Temple too, but I felt it more so in this, where there are, I think, 2 spots where you need him to play the song. You need him to play the Wind God's aria to basically unlock the door. So he pretty much acts as a key twice, just getting from room to room in this dungeon, which kind of reinforces that even more. It's like, all right, I gotta get this little guy over to this spot.
That part where it's kind of scripted that he's supposed to get caught, like that doesn't happen with Medley. He's thrown into a little jail cell, and it does add to like him being more vulnerable.
You know, it's interesting because I think it plays into the kind of thematics of the dungeon, and it plays into what it's trying to do really well. But I can also see the argument that, and this is something that Wind Waker dungeons like to do a lot, where it starts off completely linear, like totally linear without a choice up to a certain point. And I feel like the fact that you have a locked door and then this forced cutscene where he gets kidnapped, it makes it feel even more so like you're just kind of going through the motions first until a certain point in the dungeon, and then it opens back up.
He gets captured, then you got to get the hook shot to come and free him.
Yeah.
And all up till that, it's fairly linear. But once he's free, there's actually some linearity here.
Yeah.
In a way that I really appreciate. I liked the idea here that once you got him, there was multiple ways you could go, for one, but also some of the ways you had to go were rooms you already went through. And they had, like you said, the big stone block where you need Makar. You had to actually backtrack to a room, and you had to actually remember it. And it was for something that wasn't just a goodie. You know what I mean? And I really thought that, like, wow, that's cool. This is like hitting the complexity of like a mid to late Link's Awakening dungeon.
That kind of scratches that itch that I feel like we've been looking for, that Wind Waker has kind of been lacking, where it's like you have a few things you have to do, and the dungeon is just so open at that point that you can do them in any order. And I really, really like that. My question, though, is it too little too late? Because I think this is the biggest example of that. And really, it's only, like I said, 3 things you have to do. I feel like this maybe should have been something that they should have been pushing into a couple dungeons ago. But here we are in the last full dungeon before the final dungeon, and we're finally getting this kind of stuff.
I do think that it's not this dungeon's problem, but it's sort of like, yeah, I do wish, like, even if there's just like one more, I mentioned it, I think, in our last dungeon discussion, like, if there was one more dungeon or something in the game that like was like really tested you.
I guess the flip side is the perk of this dungeon is what we've been talking about. There's a lot of decent movement stuff, and there's a lot of cool item interaction stuff. But I don't, in my opinion, especially coming off of the heels of something like Earth Temple, there aren't really that many super clever one-off puzzles, or any puzzles that specifically make you think really hard about what the solution is. It kind of feels like the navigation and just the utilization of your items is what requires most of the thinking in this dungeon. And it's definitely a pretty action-heavy dungeon, too.
It's more of a platformer type thing to me, you know what I mean? You mentioned here, you know, and I've talked about, too, like looking at the map, using the compass. That's something that even like in like Ocarina of Time, that's not something I felt like I had to do often. And so I would say my other defense here of like the standout puzzles is, we already made this point, but it kind of brings it back to one of my favorite puzzles in Zelda games, which is just navigating the dungeon, you know? So I've played this before, and I know, like, okay, it gets kind of non-linear here. And honestly, like, I mostly kind of remember the dungeon, so I feel like I could have maybe gone through the motions, but instead I was thinking about it, okay, it's my first time, I've got Makar, now there's all these ways you can go, and you can navigate this big room and go different routes and stuff. So I found myself like, okay, what would I do now? And I look, you know, you look at your map and you see, okay, like, I've gone down through that door and down that path, but there's a door I haven't gone through in there, and like a chest, so like maybe I need to go down that path, you know? And it's not like all immediately right there to you. So I would say honestly, just the big standout, like, quote unquote puzzle in this one is just like trying to get around and, figure out where you need to go next, which is cool. I thought that was really cool.
There are a few puzzle highlights type things that I wanted to mention just because, like, even though there were only a few in the dungeon, I felt super strong about them. We talked about using the iron boots to spring on the metal springs and doing it to go through holes in the floor. I got really big Oracle games trampoline vibes. Because that feels just like one of those where you jump up through a gap and you're like, all right, there's a hole there, so I got to position this trampoline here and then jump up to the next floor. One of the other ones is... Actually, both of these are just for optional. I think they both might be for treasure charts. One is in like a small key room, and it's one of the ones where there are like, I don't know, 5 or something different breakable spots. Actually, that might be in the same room with the spring thing where you got to jump through the hole to get the small key, and then the spikes drop and you can just leave the room. If for some reason you have the completionist mindset to be like, well, no, I gotta break all of these little spots. If you do that, then it rewards you with a little chest. And I was like, that's awesome. That's cool that that's there.
That's a good optional use of, I think, the compass. Because if you're looking and you're like, what do I do in this room? And you even see a spot. It's like at some point you're like, I guess maybe I'll just, because if you break certain ones, like enemies appear. So at that point, like it gets you thinking like, oh, I should break these and see what comes up.
And then that brings me to my next one, which is one that like super I was like, bravo, Wind Waker, that was a really clever one. And it's in, I think it might not be the mini boss room, but it's one of the rooms like it, where it's a big circle and there's a bunch of the faces and spots where you can hookshot on the walls. And I think the first time you go in there, the objective is just like beat some enemies and then a chest appears or the gate opens or something like that. But if you're looking at your map and compass, you notice, like, wait, there's another chest in here, but there's nothing left for me to do in here. But if you go up to one of the ledges and you use your iron boots to pull the mask down, there's one hidden bokoblin behind the mask. And if you kill him, then it makes another chest appear. And I was like, that rocks. That's so sneaky. Also, I think we talked about it a little bit, but the mini-boss, there's one room that's got like 3 dark nuts, which is really cool, and this is when they start piling all those tough enemies onto each other, which is awesome. And the mini-boss where the music starts playing is when you have, like, I think it's 2 dark nuts, and then one of those crazy wizrobes that summons a bunch of other stuff, and that's kind of just regular enemies, but I really like that mini-boss fight.
Yeah, I do too. It's cool. But we can't end talking about the dungeon without talking about the boss. Once you get through that whole non-linear section of the game, you get the boss key and all that. In the deepest pit of the dungeon, we get this huge sandworm, Mulgara. That music starts playing. Everyone gets fired up. Everyone loves this song.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, Mulgara, it's this big sandworm. It's got this big maw that you have to avoid getting chomped by. But a tongue that can be targeted by the hook shot. And it'll pull it in close and you can get some attacks in. Eventually, Mulgara will send out its little babies to kind of cause a bit of a distraction. And also come out and fly around the room and try to come chomping down on you.
This theme is an undisputed banger, for one thing.
Yes. Yeah, of course.
I think this is probably... I don't know. We would have to do a boss ranking, but I think this is one of the best bosses in the game. It's not a super complex fight or anything, but we've talked about how some of the bosses in this game, particularly ones like Kalidamos, really keep you on your toes. And I think this one is more challenging than most of the other boss fights, but 2, it really keeps you on your toes. Because the sand is constantly moving and sinking, and Mulgara is pulling you closer to its maw, so you really have to make sure that you're in the right spot, far enough away, where you're not going to get sucked in, but close enough to where you can hookshot to the eyeball and start doing the slashy thing. And then to top that off, like if you're not paying attention to those little Mulgara babies, they can add up and there can be like 6 like jumping around at the same time, which make it not even safe for you to back up. So
right.
I think I would maybe like it more if there was like a different phase or something, but compared to the bosses that are in this game, I think it definitely does a great job.
Like, you can't just like kind of stand there and spam a button or anything, you know, like it's engaging still. And this one, I agree with you that it's probably the most so far, especially with the little, almost like the little distractions it sends out, and the music fits it so well, so it ties it all together. Yeah, it's a good. I enjoy this fight. Once you get enough hits in on that tongue, you take it down. And here, we get to conduct Makar one more time. We restore the power to the Master Sword. It's nice. It's not with Makar, you're just sort of like, good job, man. Like, I'll see you later, buddy. You're cool.
Thanks, pal.
I like this moment right after the dungeon. We get news from the Fishman that after our last encounter with Ganondorf, he's totally abandoned the Forsaken Fortress, which is, to the King of Red Lions, it's super unsettling. He's like worried about Zelda and stuff. He's like, what could this mean? He just kind of tells us like, hey, you got to go get the rest of the pieces of the Triforce.
This is something that I'm sure we're going to talk about in a future episode, and something that we've hinted at several times is that you've either been told or been hinted at to start collecting these Triforce shards. And now you're at the moment where it's like, that's what you have to do to move forward. So I think it's kind of fitting that the King of Red Lions, this is the official, like, all right, now you got to get this done.
So, if we are looking at this on our list of Wind Waker dungeons, we've compared it to most of them, I think, so far, just in talking about it. But like, where does it stand for you in the game?
Something I knew for sure is that I didn't like it more than Tower of the Gods. I have Tower of the Gods very high, and we definitely disagree a little bit on Tower of the Gods, but that's one that I hold near and dear to me, and I think it impresses me a lot more consistently than the Wind Temple. And this was probably one of the most critical I've been of the Wind Temple in any of my recent playthroughs of this game, because it's a late game one. By the time you get through it, you're kind of just going through the motions. I've always kind of just resigned myself to being like, yeah, I like that one. But this time I really thought about it and wanted to critique it and stuff. So I knew it was below Tower of the Gods, and I knew it was above Forbidden Woods, because it reminded me a lot of Forbidden Woods, and I just felt like this was a little bit more of a satisfying, fleshed out version of that. So basically what it came down to is whether or not I liked it more or less than the Earth Temple. And I was telling you, this was one of the hardest to place for me, just because I knew generally like where I wanted it to be, which was around Earth Temple, but because Earth Temple and Wind Temple have such different strengths, but I like them both a lot, I just kept going back and forth with which one I like better. And in the end, I decided I liked Wind Temple better. And I think especially now that we've talked about like the different, that it's meant to be more of like a platforming challenge thing, and a lot of the cool item interactions, that kind of eased some of the what felt like lack of puzzles for me. So I knew it was above Earth Temple, but then on my list, right above Earth Temple, I have ones like Jabu Jabu's Belly, which is super puzzle heavy and navigation heavy. Sword and Shield Maze, which is also super puzzle heavy. Key Cavern, Angler's Tunnel, Unicorn Cave. So like, immediately right
yeah.
after Earth Temple, I was like, all right, well, here's this big chunk of really complex, really thought-provoking, well-designed dungeons. And I couldn't justify putting Wind Temple higher than any of those. So what I ended up doing is putting it right above Earth Temple and right below Jabu Jabu's belly.
I appreciate that. I think, this has been kind of a theme. I think Tower of the Gods has been our biggest thing where, like, we don't fully agree, but I think we're, like, on the same wavelength pretty much otherwise. Because, so on my list, I was looking at it, and we kept bringing up Forbidden Woods, and I was, like, so happy you did, because this, like, to me, compared to the last two dungeons, we talked about all those items. I felt like Forbidden Woods, it felt like from Dragon Roost to that, you sort of had, like, these items, like, kind of a logical progression of, like, the items and, like, them being mixed together. And then in Tower of the Gods, just from an items perspective, you sort of had, you did have use of stuff, but, like, I felt like the bow didn't really, like, shake that up necessarily. And, like, I mean, what do you even get in the Earth Temple? You get the Mirror Shield.
Yeah,
like,
Mirror Shield.
So, like, I feel like that, it's kind of its own, like, isolated thing. And then here I found myself, especially when I was, like, when I was in the later part, when I had the hook shot, I was like, oh, this has like all those items mixed in, like, from the previous dungeons, as well as, like, the iron boots that I got here. And it's sort of like a yin and yang situation, I feel like, because in Forbidden Woods, I like the overall, like, the puzzles, I think of, like, using the leaf to, like, push those little nuts that you gotta break the eyeballs on the doors. All that was really cool. Whereas here you didn't have that, but in Forbidden Woods, I felt like what was kind of lacking was actually the navigation. And so I felt like these kind of have different strengths and weaknesses, you know what I mean? But, like, overall, I felt like this continued that sort of element from Forbidden Woods that I really loved. So I think this is my favorite so far. I wanted to give it a fair shot too, because I think the tendency for some people is to just, like, tendency for a lot of people is, like, this one is the worst dungeon, or, it's annoying or whatever. But I think then there's a lot of people who are, like, more like us, who are, like, kind of really getting in the nitty gritty, nitpicking these things, and they just go, like, oh, Wind Temple is obviously the best one because it's, like, non-linear.
Yeah. Yep.
And I didn't want to do that, but then as I was playing it, I was like, yeah, like, I really appreciate, like, having to remember, or even looking at my map. I was, like, blown away. I, like, looked at the map, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that, on top of, like, just, like, the platforming element of it reminded me more of something like Dancing Dragon or something like that, where there's just a lot of fun little, like, one-shot challenges. They weren't necessarily these one-shot puzzles, you know what I mean? So it kind of had a good mix, I think, for me, of, like, a big dungeon you explore around with some, like, fun challenges mixed in, even if there wasn't, like, the rest of the game's strengths lie more in these individual puzzles from room to room, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I put it at the top. And maybe that's predictable, but that's where I went. But then, yeah, now I'm looking at my list, and it's a similar thing to you, where I'm looking at dungeons above it that are, to me, I'm like, these are, like, some of the awesome top dungeons of the game. And so I was, like, not really sure where I wanted to put it. I think you have it. So you have it at 20.
Yeah, I have it right at 20.
And if I slotted mine in right above, it would be at 20. But I don't know. Can I? Like, you even said, like, Sword and Shield Maze is, like, a great, awesome one. I mentioned Dancing Dragon, actually, which is that's not a too complicated. It's similar. I feel like it's not too complicated, but it's a heck of a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Moonlit Grotto has that cool puzzle. And everyone knows I have a soft spot for Misery Mire.
Yeah.
That should be in the top 10. What are we doing here? You know what? I think I'll put mine at 22, just to be like, we're like
nice.
Wind Waker buds, I feel like.
Nice.
So, and so that brings, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but that is like, that is sort of what I see as like the issue of the game, is we're getting to the end and like, it's not, for me personally at least, it's not cracking like the top 10s of like the dungeons, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But we're going to talk in the next episode. We got to get the rest of those Triforce pieces, or some people, you might have to get all of them. We're going to talk about an aspect of the game that I think, while we've talked about its flaws, I think has been a highlight of the game for me, and what makes the game stand out and cool. So, I don't know. I'm pretty excited to get to the Triforce quest.
Yeah, I'm very excited.
All right, Corey. Well, it was great chatting with you about this dungeon. Thanks everyone for watching. Let us know, is it blasphemous? I feel like everyone says the Earth Temple is way better. So are we both? Now you're joining me as a blasphemous one.
Oh yeah, I'm a blasphemer.
By putting it one spot above on your list.
By putting it just above.
Yeah, we'll see everybody in the next episode.